talked about how to create a read-write desktop database. Access will create a reporting database for you for the desktop from the web apps, but it's read-only. And so what we basically do is go in and just use code to change the connect property of the table, and then you're able to read-write. Of course, you have to do some settings first to enable the read-write and that kind of thing in Access. But I'm not going to go over that. You can look at the YouTube video for that. But that's what we're seeing now. I know it's a blank screen, but these are the link tables to one of my web apps, and this is just sample data. It's if you know any of these people here, just pretend you don't. But all these, I got most of these names from other Access MVPs. A lot of sample data. But as one of the things that has been a problem or complaint with Access web apps is it's all siloed off into itself, and it's not easy to get data into the web apps. And until they added the ability to export the data to Excel, it's been difficult to get it out. But by using these linked tables and also other means, you can, VBA specifically, we can do a lot of data management for the database. And we're going to look today at two different ways mainly to do it. First of all is just by using a pass-through query def and use the SQL and execute that. And we'll use a lot of VBA. It's basically run by VBA. Because I'll take data from one table and we're going to put it into our web app on the Azure SQL database. And we're going to do that using, like I said, the SQL and pass-through query def and executing that, and show you how to do that with code. Another thing, the next thing that we'll do after that is we will look at using stored procedures in the Access web app itself and using it through VBA on our desktop. Now, if you like stored procedures, that's a really good thing. There's some very good features to stored procedures that make them a good option sometimes. It takes a little bit more work. But we'll show you how to create the stored procedures that you want to use, and then we'll show you the code on how to use them. Okay? So basically, we're going to be looking at a lot of code and things today, and so I hope most of you guys can probably do better at this than I can. Let me get this out of the way. Okay. Basically, what we want to do is, I'm just going to show you an example, is I have a table in my web app, and let's look at my web app. I'll go ahead and launch it. And while we do that, I'll look at now this is my web app development screen in which you develop the web apps. And we're going to be dealing with this table, the table people. So let's look at, oops, sorry, showing you my, don't want to see my spam. Here's my web app. Here's the table people. I didn't have any other bunch of text handy for large fields, so I just used a bunch of SQL that I had loaded up in tables. So So at any rate, we got a lot of SQL we can look at, but what it does is show the way that we can load that data. All this data I loaded into that using VBA. And so you can put a lot of data in there, and that makes it easy, especially when you got these large fields. You got a lot of data that you want to put in there, a lot of information, and it makes it a lot easier to do it. Okay, towards the end of data sheets, and okay, we're going to look at a couple things, and we're going to go ahead and I'll start off with this. On table people. Notice we got the field full name. So if we look at the table, well, I can't write. I can't get it on the website. Excuse me. Back here. If we look at the table, we'll see that's a calculated field. Okay, we don't use that. We don't set that in code or in a store procedure or VBA or anyway. It sets itself. And so as we do that, we'll be skipping that. So I just wanted you to make note of that. We'll also look at how to handle all these different data types, because SQL Server is picky, much like Access is when it comes to code. But I've found some ways to handle it that work pretty good for me, and maybe some of you have some really good ideas. So let's go back to the desktop, because this is where we got the data. And this is my this is what's on my web app. I've got 70 records, or ID of 66 records. And I have a table with a lot more records. Okay, 448 records. So we got a lot of sample data we can load up there. And let's see, it's past ID 7. And I'm going to close that. Now, what we want to do is use VBA to move the data from our local table here. And this is just one place to get data. I know many of you know how to get data from lots of places. This is just one place to get data from one table loaded into another. And makes it easy in the code. So let's go to my okay. So here we have the procedure, and this procedure here will load up all the data one record at a time. Well, excuse me. No, this one will load it up as many records as you want. I did so many of these procedures. Okay, so as we look at this, this is pretty cut and dry till we get to the part where we create what's called a temporary pass-through query. The way that we do that, and that's what we're going to use to upload the data. The way that we do that is by not using a name. Ordinarily, here where the quotation marks are, you put the name of the query depth you want to create. This is a method that Microsoft has recommended quite a few years back. Works really well because it lasts only as long as that procedure is running, and once the procedure ends, it goes out of memory. No one can, there's no name to it, no one can get any data off of it or connection string or anything from it. So it's a pretty safe and secure way to do things. Before we go along, I want to just share with you one more thing before we kind of get started in this. You'll see this right here where we get the connection string. And in getting the connection string, one of the things that I found is that if you ever open access file, whether it's an ACCDB or DE or whatever you want to make it, open it with a hex editor, you can see all the names of your procedures in the file. It's kind of scary. All right. So one thing I did, now I'm kind of a security freak about this especially. And I don't care if you guys see my connection string here because I'm going to change my password when we get through. Okay. And this is just a sample thing. So this is a obfuscated name, something that no one would think much of. String item color, well, that's a variable. That doesn't sound like a procedure name. But that's what it is. It's procedure, and I have what I call a procedure password there. That's about 29 characters, random characters there that I put in the procedure. And let's go to that procedure. And as you'll see, you have to enter that in the procedure, because this is what it'll return, nothing, VB null string. If you don't enter in this as one of the arguments, then you're just going to go out the back end of the procedure and you'll get nothing. And so this is a security measure that I use to protect the connection strings, and this is kind of the holy grail that you got to watch out for with your data. So that's why you do that with that. Works pretty well. And copy and paste the connection string. Don't have any problem with it. Pretty simple. So if you want, I have used times where I simplified something a little bit to call that. Made it a little easier on myself. But you may think of some ways to do that. So as we go through the code, and it'll skip through here, this is what this is. This is just my way of protecting the connection string. Okay, let's go back to where we were. Okay, so we want to copy the data from the table people demo data table to the table people table in the Access Web Apps Azure SQL database. Now that's the SQL Server in Azure, so to speak. Yeah. And I think that's one of the best things about Access Web Apps. You got security, you've got a good system of protection of your data, and you get free Azure SQL databases. I mean, I'm waiting for Microsoft to wake up and say, hey, these people are using free databases. So I really like it. I think it's a great deal. I think it's one of the best bargains around, and especially since we can do some of these workarounds and do some of the things that we need to do when handling large loads of data. Okay, so as we run through this procedure, we're going to open a record set, and we're also going to create this query def. And so let's look at it. Of course, we use current DB. I use a variable for that. And so we set this record set, which is the local tables record set. And as you see, the string SQL is entered in as one of the arguments of the procedure up here. So you can enter in which records identified by the ID, what you want to enter in, and add here, as long as you do a select all or you select all the fields. And that allows a lot of versatility in procedure. So as the procedure runs, we create the query def, which is a temporary pass-through query, which means that the data is passed straight through virtually to the Azure SQL database without changing it. So that it works really a lot quicker than working on your tables, your linked tables, or using record sets with your linked tables. This is a much quicker way of handling data than doing that. Okay, so one of the first things we do is we're going to open the record set. We create the query def, but we're not through with the query def because we've created the connection string there. Use that variable for the connection string. And you got to do this in the proper order, because if you don't, if you get something out of sequence with this query def here, then it's not going to work. Okay, so I'm using open a record set, using it where I don't have to type in RST all the time. Use a do while not in the file loop. And what we do now is build the SQL that's used to insert the data into the Azure SQL database table. And we do that step by step. My variable for that is the string SQL SS for SQL Server. We got the fields that we're going to deal with. And remember that we have to skip the calculated field. The rest of them we can work with. And so we do an insert into, just like you would in Access, and then we add the values part and start the parentheses, and then we want to put the values in there separated by commas. Now here's where we got to deal with the data types, and this is the critical part of pretty much of dealing with this. You have to know how to deal with the data types. And some of the things we're going to go over here are going to save you a lot of headaches, hopefully. So one of the things that you do is when you have a string, data type of text, whether it's long text, short text, varchar, varchar, whatever, and don't bug me on my pronunciations, because different people do it differently, and I've not seen the manual that says the correct way to pronounce it. So, anyway, what we do with the text is the single quotation mark, like right there, will really throw a tripwire, really blow up your code, cause a big error, stop everything if you don't handle it right with SQL Server or the Azure SQL database, because that's what it uses. That single quotation mark is what it uses as to signify text. Like Access can use either the double quotation marks or the single. With SQL Server or Azure SQL database, they only use the single. So if you have a name with O'Hara in it and it's got a quotation mark, or any place, a restaurant name, a street name, or anything with that single quotation mark in it, and it's in the middle of your string of text, it's going to cause an error. So the way to deal with that is double up on the single quotation marks. And then SQL Server will recognize, oh, that's a quotation mark within the string. And so it'll skip over that, won't cause an error. So that's why we're using the replace function here. And we're simply using the first name field from the database, from the local table, and we're just replace. If there happens to be any quotation marks, we change it. We don't bother checking for them. It works just as fast this way. Same thing with all the other strings, for middle name, last name, suffix. A lot of these, I know up in Europe, England, I was told that I did some work for someone there one time, and they told me they don't use a lot of suffixes. Well, we got a whole lot of the first, the seconds, the thirds, juniors, and seniors here in the U.S., so we use suffixes quite a lot in names. Then we got the notes. This is the long text, and handled the same way as the other, as far as the SQL goes. No difference. And so then we get to a number. And now I've not used a lot of math and stuff in SQL Server. So as far as I know, you pretty much handle the numbers the same. You just put them within the SQL, no quotation marks around the data. And that's what this does here. this also works this way with numbers that include decimals. Anything higher than some currency, don't ask me. I haven't dealt with anything like that. Also, we've got a postal code ID. That's a location ID. It's a postal code ID. These are foreign keys. And then we get to and many of you know all this stuff already, so I hope I'm not boring you too bad. But now we get to what can be a big bugaboo for some people, and this is the byte data type, which is what is used for yes or no in the Azure SQL database, or true or false. And the thing about the byte data type in SQL Server or Azure SQL databases, it cannot be null. You can have null for other data types, but not for byte. So you've got to put something in there. So this is what we do. Just check if the data that we're getting from the record set, if it's not null, we check if it's true. Then if it's true, we add SQL Server's equivalent to true, which is 1, whereas in Access we use a -1 or a -1. SQL Server we use a 1, positive 1. And so, if it's true, then it's 1. If it's not true, obviously it's got to be false, so it's 0, which is the same as in Access and SQL Server. And we just check and make sure. If it's null, we come down here and it adds a 0 into your string of data that you're passing for that record. Then we get to dates. Dates can be tricky in SQL Server, but if you use you can use the format function here, and if you'll format it like the way we got it there, you can leave off the seconds, or you can leave off all the time if you want to. But you have to format it pretty much that way. Now, somebody else may know another way of doing it, but this is the way I know to do it. Send it in as a string, and therefore the single quotation mark here and at the end. And send it in as a string in this format, year, month, date. Avoids all the headaches we get in Access for different countries. For people in Australia and the UK who think we've got things backwards, and I'm sure they're probably right. So we avoid that with SQL Server. We do year, month, date, hours, minutes, and seconds, and that way you can avoid it. Now SQL Server goes to a much longer precision than Access does, but we don't worry about that. They'll just put zeros in there, so automatically no problem with it. We won't deal with that. And then we just want to trim up the SQL Server because we basically got everything, and we want to make sure that everything's taken care of. And I just saw something here. I'm going to change this real quick and do a little editing on the fly. This is when the record was saved. Well, obviously we're saving the record, so I don't need to have that be a null. Use the now function, and we'll format it, and it'll handle it like that. So if it and I could use is null here. Either way it works. You can check use the len function or use is null. Either way works fine. And so now making sure that the record has a time when it was saved. And so we trim up, get to the end, we trim up, we get rid of that last comma, because if we don't, it's going to throw an error. And so this is what this loop here does. It checks do while on the right, if there's a comma, it takes it off and checks again, and trims it again, checks it again, because you can have spaces in there and they'll throw you. And so then we close off that parentheses. We started off with the values and started parentheses, and this is the ending of the parentheses, and semicolon here. We got to end. This is the pretty much standard now for SQL Server for submitting the SQL there. And so what we do now, finally, we set the SQL to that query def. And that's what we've been doing this whole time, building the SQL for that record. And then we execute it, and you can do it by the query def SQL. You have to set the returns records to false. That's very important. Don't skip that part when you're saving the data through the pass-through query def. And so then we do the query def execute. We don't have to use db execute. We can use query def execute, which is really good. It executes that unnamed pass-through query. And then we got a little extra there where we count. I got some more stuff to make things run easily. If you know VBA, if you've done record sets, you know how to use the mod function and to use that there. So we've got a lot of data here. So I'm going to take and I'm going to see if we got. I'm going to see if we can run this. And I don't know if we got 211. We'll find out. And I want to enable this. We'll stop that and we'll take a look at that SQL. So let's see what this does for us. Okay, we'll print the SQL. And so that's what we got. You got all the fields. There's the values. First name Brian, no middle name, no suffix. Then we got our notes field, and that's all that SQL you see there. Don't let that confuse you. That's what that is, and this quotation mark actually goes right there. And so we got the IDs. We got location ID, postal code ID, and that's the archive. It's not archived, so it'd be false and 0. That's correct. And then we got the date, and so it picked up the date that was already saved in the record. And so it's ready to go, and let's see if it'll work. It was working earlier today. So here's the big moment. Boom. Okay, it worked. All right. Okay, so we move next with the loop. I didn't have any more. I didn't have but one record in that loop, so we get the loop in. So, and it returns true at the end. So that's one way to do it with it. Just VBA. Create some SQL for a unnamed pass-through query def, send it on the SQL Server. It works pretty well, works pretty fast. If you got a lot of data, it'd be better probably to use a stored procedure, but that's more work, and that's up to you, what you want to choose to do. But I wanted to show you both ways in order to do that. And that's just inserting records. Is there any questions at this time for this so far? Okay, well, I'm not hearing any questions, so I don't know if there's some setting I need to do or. Okay. No questions so far, Dave? All right. Okay. That's the way to do an insert with using the SQL and a unnamed pass-through query def. Nice handy way to do it. If it fails, no problem. You don't have to go back and save a query def some other way or something, just fix your code and let it run. And there'll be times when you'll have something will throw a monkey wrench in things, something will upset the SQL and cause a problem. But that works pretty well. I've used that a lot. For the last year, I've been working almost exclusively in Access and SQL Server, and I have written thousands and thousands of lines of code to move data from Access to the SQL Server. I was working for some people that had a lot of work for me to do. They had a kind of strange way of doing things, but anyway, it paid the bills, so that worked out good for me. So that's the first way. We can go ahead and show you basically how to see if I did a delete. No, I didn't do it. Let's go ahead, let's look now at stored procedures. And we're going to look next on how to do the same type of insert using a stored procedure. Sorry about the noise there. And go up to the top. That's where we start on that. Before we store procedures in the Azure SQL database, you can create them by creating data macros in your web app. And I have some created down here. And I have one, here's one that's a delete. And you only got one parameter, which is the ID, which is pretty nice. Nice and simple. But when you want to do an insert, you need to do a parameter for every one of them. And so let's look at that. It can take a little while, but it's not too bad once you get the hang of it. Okay, stored procedures, when you do inserts and updates and also deletes, you have to use parameters for things to work out. And let's go to SQL Server here for a minute, because here's the data macro, and that's what you create. And when you save that data macro, and this is the data macro where you click the advanced, go down here to data macro. Just a standalone data macro, and you enter the parameters. Click the create parameter button and put your parameter name in and do the data type, and that will show up in your, let me do this, easy for you to find. Okay, here's your database using SQL Server Management Studio. You can connect to your Azure SQL database, and you click on the programmability, if I can speak today, and this is the data macro we're going to use next. And so I'm just going to do a script to create it, which it won't do because it's already exists, so you don't have to worry about messing it up. But you can get a good look at it by using this. And this is what we get in the Azure SQL database. Now, it does a lot of stuff in here. It accounts for the trace tables. If trace is on, it checks for that, and it does a lot of checking for other things. And I understand most of the stuff in here. One or two things I don't, but just about everything. If you're used to using stored procedures, here's basically what you need to know. This is your main part right here that you're going to be dealing with in a code. These are your parameters. And it really helps if you can use named parameters. And because if, for instance, you got one of the parameters that you don't want to use, you don't have to use it. You just skip it if you got them named. if you got it set up right. And using the name parameters, you don't have to worry about getting them in order. You can put them in any order you want in the VBA, and it'll work out just fine. So those parameters that we had here in the data macro, that's exactly what we got here, same thing. I actually went and copied this and pasted it into Access VBA so it would make it a little bit quicker for me to use those in the code. And as you go down, it checks a lot of things that, like I said, some of these things I don't know what it's doing, but I do know it's checking for the log action trace and whether or not it's going to put them in there. If you got tracing on, it'll save that into tracing. For those that don't know, the N is signifying that what's in the quotation marks is in varchar data type instead of just varchar. And anytime you see access system as the first schema, that's something that you and I don't usually work with. We work with what we create, and they'll have an access schema. So here we got what it's doing is it's saving the information into the trace tables if you got it set up for that. And it's also doing what I told it to do. It's doing left trim, right trim, exactly what I had down in the code there. Excuse me, in the macro. Well, look at this. So it did the middle name. Well, I wanted to make sure there wasn't a bunch of blank spaces there, so I did left trim, right trim for the parameter for middle name. So if we had a parameter middle name and it had, you know, a value there, then we got rid of the extra spaces on the outside. And that's exactly what it does. It does that. Whatever you do here, down in here, it does it in the stored procedure. So that's what it's doing in SQL Server. So now if you're used to using SQL Server in the SQL Server Management Studio or in Access, if you're used to using stored procedures, so you'll understand a lot of this. And here's where it inserts the data into the trace if you got it set for that. Then here's some error catching. Anyway, I just wanted to show you where that's at. That's in there. You can look at it and see what it's doing. They do a whole lot more complicated ones than I do. So as we go down for this, basically we got text in the fields. First name, text. I check. I know I'm going to have a first name. I check up here, make sure I got a first name and last name. If I don't have a first name and last name, we're not saving anything in the record. You got to have a first name and a last name. Keep that data good. And so check the middle name, check the suffix, get rid of any blanks, and if we have, and I often use the len function, and I find that right handy, and I'm used to using it, so I use it a lot, and so I'm quite glad to find out it works with the macros, and helps me out. And so, you know, if there's nothing there, then we're just gonna pass. And so that's what we're going to do with that. Then we've got what I do here is location ID. Well, if it's null, it's going to pass a null, and I know that we allow nulls in that field, so I don't worry about checking for nulls for that ID. So if it's already null, it's just going to pass a null in there, no problem. If you don't allow nulls, then you need to check for it. And so we get through that, we get to the notes, and we just pass that like it is. Then we get down to the archive field, and that's the yes or no field or true false. And so we have to put a value in that. I check to make sure if it's null, then we have to say no. And actually we'll enter in as a 0, and we'll see that in the code. And then yes, if which will be +1, which we looked at earlier, but it's going to be formatted a little bit different. Yeah. And then at the end, of course, when saved, obviously we're inserting this, we're saving it now, so we're going to go ahead and enter the date now. And since we're doing it like this, it'll take it that way, and you don't have to worry about any hang-ups with that date and that. So let's go back to the code now. But that's how you do that's how you create your stored procedures. Remember, data macros equals stored procedures. And the standalone data macros equal your stored procedures. And so that's how you can create stored procedures in SQL Server in your Azure SQL database and use those things. And if you're one of the guys that like to use them, I love the name stored procedures. They work really well. And so if you like doing that, that'll be something that you may want to be doing. Takes a little time to put these together. Yeah, it's a little bit of work, but once you get it done, it's done. You got main tables, then that's a good thing, pretty good thing to do there. Stored procedures, as probably most of you know, are prone to run faster in SQL Server because they tell me the execution plan has already been created when you save the stored procedure, and instead of when you send over a pass-through query and that SQL gets sent over, it examines it then, figures out a plan, tries to run the plan, may adjust the plan, and it may take longer to run to save data, change data, modify data using just a pass-through query with SQL than it will a stored procedure. Stored procedures, you pretty well know what you're going to get most of the time. They're pretty well set, especially if you've been using them. And they, as I said, the execution plan is supposedly already done for you and it's ready to go. Now, I know that they all the time they're making changes to SQL Server. I don't even halfway, I can't even keep up with Access, much less SQL Server. So they may change that sometime, but as far as I know, that's one of the good things about stored procedures. Another's security, and because this data that's passed in, these parameters, they have to be they're passed in as that specific data type, so it's harder for someone to do SQL injection into your database. So that's probably enough for that. Let's go back to Access. Let's look at, do the same table, and we're going to do the same thing. This time we're just going to look at it using stored procedure. Okay, so we're doing the table people again. We're just going to be inserting records. This time we're just going to do one at a time. So basically we'll start off pretty much the same way. I use a module level variable there for the DAO database. A lot of times I'm doing data and I'm using a whole lot of the procedures at the same time in that same module, and it makes the code run a little bit quicker. Yeah. All right, so, but it checks if that variables is not, it's nothing there, then it sets the object variable as a current database. Then we begin the SQL. Now this SQL is a SQL from our local table. And what we'll do is we just build the SQL, and then the where state is the different part. and we want to make sure we've got an ID, and that's passed in right here as one of the arguments of the procedure. And so we got a long for ID. We want to make sure the first name's not null and the last name's not null in that record in that table. If it is, we don't want to run it. So that avoids that problem right off the get-go. I find that a lot you can do really make things run if you limit what you get to start with in your record set. It really helps out a lot. And this makes sense to do. Makes it run quicker. You can save a lot of time running through records you don't need to go through. Works good. So here we get the connection string. We create that local record set for the local table. Now we start our query data. The temporary pass-through query again. Use that again. Use one of those again. We set the connect property. Now we're going to build the SQL of the pass-through query data. And do that with the record set in Access, getting the data from the table. So we opened it up, and that SQL statement, if there's no first name or no last name, it's going to be EOS and BOS. And that's what it's checking for. And if it is, no record, and let you know, so you don't have a problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Patrick, I hate to interrupt, but for some reason the audio is breaking up. Is anybody else having trouble?
Let me see if my voice gets a little hoarse. Let me see if this is a little bit better.
Yeah, that was a little bit better. Is anybody else, or is it just me that's having trouble?
Could be my voice is just getting tired. Let me take a little sip.
No, it was definitely something electronic.
Really?
Yeah. Was it like I say? It could be just me though. So does anybody else have a problem?
I'm not hearing anything from anyone else if you are.
Well, I think it's better now, but I'm not really sure. But yeah, once you go ahead, and if it comes back, we can deal with that.
Hi George, it's Lucy.
Yeah,
there are some comments that it was breaking up.
Okay, so it wasn't just
really?
Me. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try this. I'm using a laptop here, and I got a monitor plugged in. So don't have the best setup. I hope you guys can hear me now. Is that better?
That seems to be better, yes.
Okay. Could be could be this old mic, and I'm sorry for any noise. I'm trying to get in position. Could be the noise. Could be my voice might have been fading. It might have been picking up as well, and it wasn't directly in front of me, so it may have been part of it. Okay. As I was saying, we created our SQL statement for our record set to make sure that we got a first name and a last name. If we don't have a first name and a last name, we don't want to say that record. This does right here when we start. That temporary pass-through query. That's we set the connect property again. Query def. We start our record set looping through the Access database table, local table, and if there's no first name, no last name, it's not going to return the messages here. SQL return no record, and it tells you to check for first name and last name. Okay, if it's okay, then we're going to do a do while loop. This is what I normally do. Some other people have their preferences. That's fine. Use what you want. I'm rather wordy in my code. Some people write rather cryptically, and I have a lot of trouble reading that. So
I'm
I have trouble reading.
I'm sorry. It's back. It was good for
Is
a
that
minute.
right?
Yeah,
All
it was
right.
good for a minute, but now it's
Well, let me check my connections here. Maybe a K. How is it now?
that one wasn't too bad.
Okay.
No.
Okay, we'll start building the SQL again. And start off the SQL for the query def by executing the stored procedure. Now, the stored procedure is two-part. You have the name and the schema. And the schema is access. This is the name of the data macro that you saved. And so that's pretty easy to remember. Then you go through and you can use your named parameters and assign the values you get in out of the root set to that named parameter. So we got first name, and we take care of any of those single quotation marks in there and avoid that tripwire. And so we go ahead on. I probably shouldn't have put it all there, but we'll skip that part. Then we handle the rest of the text field the same way. And we get to the location ID. Remember, the number, it's got to be handled a little bit differently. You don't put it in quotation marks. And so we got location ID. Direct it off to it right, the data, the number. So as it shows up in SQL, this equals the number in the comma. And thing with this other, these are foreign keys, by the way. These are, I forgot to mention that.
Patrick, I'm sorry to interrupt you once again, but now we seem to have frozen the screen. We're not seeing. We're seeing down as far as the first name. Let me
see what I got here.
And I don't know. Apparently, there's a issue with the.
Oh my! Sorry about that.
It could be Skype.
Let me try it again.
Yeah, Judy's.
Error occurred during the screen presentation. Yeah. Let me see if I can. Well, it shows I'm not presenting the desktop.
Now we seem to have lost the audio entirely.
Well, I've not been talking.
I'm
trying to fix a video.
Okay, so Patrick, if you try and stop sharing your desktop and then reshare it, that should fix it.
Looked to me like I've already stopped sharing it. You know what? It says my connection is causing. Yeah. Oh man, bad time for these kind of things. What it shows got a good connection. I don't know what the problem is.
I'm wondering.
But it shows that I'm not sharing the desktop anymore.
Yeah. The screen's frozen and your audio is fading in and out. So, Lucy, do you think if you just completely leaves the Skype meeting and then comes back, would that help?
Yes, that would be one option. Yes.
Okay.
And that's what Judy suggested too. So why don't you try that? We'll just sit here and chat amongst ourselves while we're waiting for you to come back. Okay, so while we're waiting for that, and I don't know, Patrick, is you gone, or yeah, maybe we'll get him back. So one of the interesting things to me is recognizing explicitly that a data macro which you create in the Access web app is in fact transferred into SQL Azure, the Azure. And Patrick pronounces it Azure SQL. We'll have to follow up later and make sure which one of us is right. But it becomes a stored procedure in the SQL Azure database, and it is the same as any stored procedure you would write yourself, up to the point where the Access team has implemented a lot of additional elements into these stored procedures to make sure they run properly in the web browser interface, but they're exactly the same thing. And for that reason, it's possible to think of kind of a continuum of code across both interfaces, and you can leverage the power of the Access web app being a very inexpensive way to host the SQL Azure database against virtually, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, against virtually any interface where you can write code, VBA being, of course, the code of choice in Access, but other tools can do the same thing. So as you're working with an Access web app, if you think in terms of leveraging the queries you write, leveraging the data macros you write in other ways, I think you can see extensions. Now, as I say, leveraging queries, they become views, and they can be linked back to Access just the same as any other view as well. So, does anybody have any comments or questions about what we've seen up to this point? And maybe unmute yourself and offer comments if you want to, or I'll just keep talking until somebody else decides to try. Okay. Lucy, how are we for time? Should we kind of end it and maybe regroup later and see if we can pick up at another time, or wrap it up, or try to come back and keep going? What do you think?
We're okay for time. We can hang on a few minutes and see if Patrick comes back.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to hang anybody up if they have other things they want to do, but I was just following along, very, very interested in what Patrick was saying. Okay, well, I wasn't prepared to talk too much. So I'm kind of thinking of recent relevant developments that we can share here. As I started out saying, and I don't remember, I think some of the people who were here at the beginning are no longer here, so I won't be repeating myself too much, that one of the reasons why I personally think this particular aspect of this tool is particularly valid is that it allows us to create a hybrid which leverages the relatively inexpensive SQL Azure database tool with a tool which we're all much more familiar with, or normally more familiar with, which is the AccessUserGroups with linked tables and VBA. And as Patrick has been showing us, linked tables is really only one way to work with that data. You can create stored procedures as data macros and execute them. You can also create pass-through queries, execute them. You can create saved pass-through queries in Access, which then are executed just as they would be in any other interface. Patrick is illustrating how to do it in code so you don't expose the connection string, but there you can, in certain cases where it's appropriate, just create and save a pass-through query and execute that against your data. And in some of my personal tools, I do that quite a bit, rather than use regular Access queries when I know that I'm not going to be needing to update that data. And again, I will kind of launch off onto that sidetrack there a little bit about pass-through queries. Judy just asked a question. I'll come back and pick up on pass-throughs. The kind of situation that Patrick is talking about is primarily for data load, which I would classify under the general heading of ETL, where you're you're extracting data from one place, transforming it, and then loading it back into a different. You would also use this strategy for an initial load if you had a big database and you wanted to start putting data from different sources. Say you're consolidating 3 or 4 Access databases into one SQL Azure tool. You would use the same approach to do each of those in the same way. So yeah, I don't see this as it's like everything else about Access. It's sort of your imagination is the only limiting factor on what you can do with this. Yes, data cleaning. As you figure out how to clean up the data as you're moving. It looks like Patrick is back. Are you there, Patrick? I think he came back in as a regular attendee. Now he is a presenter. So I will just wrap up my one. Oh yeah, cut and paste is painful in more ways than one. Not only is it harder to get clean data, it's just a slow, tedious process. Let me wrap up my final comment here on pass-throughs while we wait for Patrick to get everything going again. Pass-through queries, as you probably know, are read-only in the Access side. So that means that you can use them to populate a combo box or a list box, for example, where you know you don't need to update them, where you only need to do a lookup against existing records. I use them in lots of places like that. Also, where I'm worried about performance, I will create a form based on a pass-through. I know that I have to create a second edit form on top of that. But on that second edit form, then I can filter that record set down to one single record that I intend to modify, rather than load the entire set of records and then try to filter by applying a filter on the form and then edit that record. So they are very helpful in speeding up Access side processes. The other thing is as you saw here, Patrick was illustrating, you can use both pass-throughs, or you use pass-throughs directly with syntax from SQL or with stored procedures to do data appends on the other side, but it requires a slightly different approach where your SQL that you're passing back doesn't depend on a bound form as you would with a regular Access query. You have to marshal the data in VBA, then execute that string to send it back. So that is kind of my comments on pass-throughs. Anybody have follow-ups on that or similar thoughts? Okay, so I see Patrick is set up as a presenter, but I don't hear him again. Are you there? Are we going to get Patrick back as a presenter? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Are you there?
I'm here. I'm having trouble.
I'm hearing you again, but it's the same in and out property or problem.
Okay. It's not a network problem. I got all the bars I can get on Wi-Fi. I'm sitting here at 15 foot for the router. I'm getting a good signal. I can see it's in the same area. So satellite software problem or something along the way.
Oh yeah, it could be latency off the satellite, yeah.
So maybe we could do this another time.
Well, yeah, that's what I was thinking. In order to be respectful of your time and everybody else who's attending, be respectful of their time, let's sort of, if you can kind of do a quick wrap up of where you were, and then we'll reconvene at a future time. And hopefully,
yeah, okay. Yeah, it's still not letting me be presenter.
So maybe just a quick verbal wrap
you
up.
You can use VBA with Access WebEx desktop databases that you create by changing the connect property on the reporting tables. Mm-hmm. And you can also use VBA, as we were looking at today, to use either pass-through query defs or pass-through query defs and stored procedures in your Access Web App, which are the data macros. And the data macros, when you create them, they create a stored procedure. So there's 2 ways in VBA that I know of to be able to pass that information along to the Azure SQL database. And we should all realize the best. Sorry we had the problems. I don't think we had this problem last time, but
no,
I've got all the bars on my network, so
yeah, we got through most of the meeting fine. It's just that last little part. Okay, well, let's call it a day. We'll get together with Patrick offline and figure out a time to reschedule him. I will kind of say I have approached about doing a presentation along a similar line. He has done a lot of work with this as well, and he actually has a presentation to do. So I asked him if he would kind of like to do a tryout or a dress rehearsal with our group, and I think that information has started to be shared with Lucy for setting up that meeting. So we'll have to work out a coordinated schedule between Jack and Patrick to see how to work both of those in. But I think, again, for me, this is an important part of being able to work with Access web apps in the near future, and with SQL Azure databases in the long
run. George, if you could post my email address, and everybody can send an email, I'll be glad to send them the code files, and they can look at that, and maybe that would.
Okay, great. There it is. I just put it in.
Just send me an email. I'll be glad to send you the code files, and although it probably won't work anymore since I'm going to change my password. But you can at least look at the code, and you can do it yourself. And you probably do like I do, a lot of copy and paste and adjusting the code and So that can help a lot.
Okay, great. And Judy just reminded me this session is being recorded, so the recording will be available later, and hopefully Lucy will work some kind of magic and clean up the audio, but I'm not sure we can hold her to that. But at least we'll be able to review the video. And that's available through the user group website, is it not, Lucy?
Yeah, it's on.
Yes.
It's on the page.
Yeah, on the Access Web App page, you'll see a page for the videos, and all the recordings are on there. I will give this recording to Alex and ask him to do what he can to improve the audio for us.
Like I say, there's no pressure there, but there may be something that can be done.
I'm not a very experienced presenter, so but I hope this has been able to help.
It's extremely useful. I enjoyed it very much. Hopefully everyone else did. And again, I think, like I say, we'll have to work out schedule. I had asked Jack if he would be available to do, like you say, a dress rehearsal of his big presentation. So we'll have to work between the two of you to.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Jack is a sharp guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and this is kind of a little more about him. Jack is also an Access MVP. I'm not sure if he is a former or current. I think he is no longer, but I'm not sure. But he runs a development company in New York, and he has done an awful lot of Access work over the years, but he's also done a lot of .NET work, and he uses SQL Azure databases with a lot of his projects. And we can talk more about that as we get closer to that. Again, thank you very much for your time and attendance. I would appreciate any feedback directly about both, the meeting and any suggestions that you have for topics you'd like to see. There's my email address, so just shoot me an email and say, hey, George, shut up, or hey, George, let's talk about XYZ. And hopefully we can continue to expand and grow. So with that, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.